right.
All right, there we go.
But
So
I'm comfortable either way.
great. Welcome to people as you're coming in to Curb Management for Policymakers. And we're going to get started right away. Welcome, everybody. I know people are joining us. Thank you for spending your morning, afternoon with us with the Open Mobility Foundation. This is a webinar on curb management for policymakers. I'm gonna get us started now because there's a lot of exciting material for us to cover. Today, I'm excited to welcome some great panelists, some special guests today as well on the topic of curb management for policymakers. We have Professor and Mayor Stephen Goldsmith, who's the Derek Bach Professor of the Practice of Urban Policy and Director of the Data Smart City Solutions at Harvard Kennedy School, also the former mayor of Indianapolis. We have Director of the Portland Bureau of Transportation, Millicent Williams. We have our own Mitch Vars, the Technical Development Specialist with the Open Mobility Foundation. And we're really excited to welcome a special guest. Andrew, did you want to do the honor of welcoming Dr. Shoup, or Aileen, is that falling to you?
Hi, everyone. I think that I will be introducing Dr. Shoup today. My name is Aileen McCallum. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Development at the OMF. So thank you so much for joining us today. I am so pleased and honored to be welcoming a very distinguished guest. I think many of you will know Dr. Shoup's work as he is the author of the 2005 book, The High Cost of Free Parking. But he's also a distinguished professor, distinguished research professor at the Department of Urban Planning at UCLA. I think many of our attendees, if you are not yet already aware, hopefully recognize that Dr. Shoup has really influenced this entire field of parking, particularly in thinking about how we manage parking and using different measures and tools to do that. Particularly as it relates to pricing. On a more personal note, being that I've been in this field for about 20-ish years, when his book came out, it really allowed us to think differently about parking and the different tools that were available to us. And so I know that I personally am incredibly grateful for the contribution that he has made to this field. And I'm excited that today we are going to be able to have Dr. Shoup make some welcome remarks to really prime us to get ready to think about some of these big and bold ideas that policymakers can use to influence curb management in their own cities. So with that, Dr. Shoup, please, we're so welcome to have you here. Thank you.
Well, thanks for inviting me to join the webinar. I'm probably here under false pretenses because when equipment manufacturers come to visit me, they seem to think that I know a lot more about the curb than they do, but it's just the opposite. I learn much more from the manufacturers than that they learn from me. And the same thing will probably happen today. I think this is a golden age for the parking technology, for monetizing the curb. Until about the year 2000, I think the parking industry was the most stagnant industry outside of North Korea. The parking meters remained just the same as the first one in 1935. You put your money in and hope to get back before your time runs out. Parking meters were called an infernal combination of a slot machine and an alarm clock. But that's still what parking payments are like. Can you think of any other payment system that hasn't changed since 1935? Everything about the payment system is is much more advanced, and still we're hoping to get back before our time gets out at the parking meter. I think that the technology that you're familiar with will continue changing, and that what we're looking at now will seem obsolete 10 years from now. I think that the payment for parking will probably be shifting from telephones to the car itself. It's already happened in Germany that your car is as connected as any telephone is, and it knows all the prices for parking on street and off street, and it can pay for parking, so that it's all in the car now, and it'll guide you to the parking space that the system, just as Google or will do now. So I think that, and when you get to where you're going, you start paying by just touching the screen of your car, and it stops paying when you leave. That you pay for what you got, and I think that will make the parking seem so much simpler. It's something that we don't even think about. Say that once automatic transmissions and power brakes and power steering seemed miraculous, and now they're so just routine for us. And I think that payment for parking will morph into that kind of technology. I think that the dynamic prices are going to be adopted much faster than I had thought earlier. That the only thing I would suggest about pricing is to look at the enormous technology among perishable goods. Parking doesn't sound like it, but it is a perishable good, like a hotel room or an airplane seat. If you don't occupy it, you can't store it. It's gone forever. So I think there's so much sophisticated technology from airlines and hotels and other things that are perishable goods, and parking ought to catch up to that. And part of that means changing prices more frequently. I know that in most of the reforms I've looked at, they seem to think you had to hold prices constant for a month or so, or 2 months, or 3 months, or Seattle, once a year they change the prices. And many people think that drivers would be confused if the prices changed from 1 week to the next. But drivers don't know what the price of parking is at a meter. You never know what the price is until you get out of your car and go to the meter. And in San Francisco, when they began changing prices every 2 or 3 months, people thought this would be so confusing, and it was never mentioned as a problem with variable prices for curb parking. Nobody remembered what the price had been a day before. And the regulars will get used to what the prices are, and the visitors, they never knew that the price was ever any different. So I think, I hope you'll focus more on making the prices more dynamic. Once I was speaking on a radio show in San Francisco when the system was new, and I mentioned that the prices could go up to for curb parking, go up to $18 an hour. And somebody phoned in, it was a phone-in program, said, well, why $18? And I said, the city said, well, that's what the private parking operators do for special events, that we have to do that. And I said, yes, if you're charged less than the off-street parking at a big event, like in San Francisco, like the Pride Parade, when about 2 million people come to revel in the streets. I said that you just have to raise the price to keep some spaces available. Somebody phoned in and said, well, I like what the professor said, but does he think that variable prices for curb parking is going to stop cruising at the Pride Parade? I think not. Well, it has a double meaning, as I meant it that way. It is, there are several kinds of cruising, but cruising for parking is the bad one. It can it congests traffic, it pollutes the air, it creates carbon emissions, and it endangers pedestrians and bicyclists. So I think that it's very important to get the price of curb parking right to prevent cruising. Let me finish by saying, how do you make this politically popular? Because nobody wants to pay for parking, including you and me. We don't want to pay for parking. Nobody will ever want to pay for parking. But you can, I think, some cities have found the key as to how to get people to want to charge for curb parking. And that is by dedicating all or most of the revenue from the parking meter to pay for added public services on the metered block. And if everybody knows that there are things that they want, like clean sidewalks or safe streets and street trees, that they want those, and the only way they can have them is to charge for curb parking. And then many people will say, I see what you mean, that the meters will pay for what I want in my neighborhood. Some cities give free transit passes to everybody who lives in a parking benefit district, like a business improvement district, but a parking benefit district. Everybody who lives in a parking benefit district gets a free transit pass, or free Wi-Fi, or they have free membership in car sharing organizations. So I think really the challenge for the curb now is to change the politics of parking. The technology is going ahead much faster than the politics. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to say this. I look forward to hearing what the rest of the program is.
That was a great introduction. Thank you so much for providing that. And I think that was a great segue, building given this audience being policymakers and other interested parties. I'm going to now, we're going to have, I mentioned in the chat that we will have time for Q&A in the end, but we're going to start off with, I'll do the slide share again. And first, a little brief bit from Mayor Goldsmith about why we should care about curb digitization, and then we'll get into a presentation from Mitch and go from there. So to start, I think you did get a great intro. We might have already covered a little bit of this, but if you could speak to this.
Well, I heard you say short and brief in your introduction to me, so I think I've got the message. Well, let me just do this way, and I'll maybe take 3 minutes. So I was mayor, but I was also deputy mayor of New York. When I was deputy mayor of New York, right, we had DOT, and DOT was in charge of parking, and you had MTA in charge of the subways, and we had taxi and limousine commission that reported to me, and you had the TNC regulation, and then we had the valet parking and curb use. And each one of those things had an agency or person or division responsible, but there was nobody responsible for either mobility management or curb and sidewalk management. And I think what we've seen over the last 10 years is thinking about the curb and sidewalk moving from a liability to be managed for who's going to fall on it or how to repair the sidewalk to an asset that the city can utilize to accomplish a set of activities. And the reason that the the reason that this conversation is so important is because it provides a way into managing systems instead of modalities. And when we bring the data together on a platform, terrific things can happen. And as we think through the rest of the presentation, I just wanted to suggest the following. If we're going to make environmental improvements and we're going to increase the use of EVs or whatever your city is advancing, then we need to have the data that reflects and encourages those uses. And there'll be more about that from Mitch later. Operational excellence. We have today the ability, if we bring all the data together, to make the work of our city employees and their contractors much more productive because they'll see real-time information on hand as they do their work on the streets. Customer-centric design, more usable information. Don mentioned a couple of these things, but if we focus on how the integration of curb and data information will make the customer's life easier, that's another way to think about it. Equity, A different way to think about Don's questioning, Don's comments is the following. If we underprice the curb and if money is fungible, then we're actually reducing the funds we have available to subsidize the transit desert. So how do we think about bringing the data together on managing the curb and sidewalk that produces equity? And one sense of equity is how do we use that data to ensure compliance over needs to penalize our residents? So just in conclusion, the OMF conversation is important because it allows the interoperability of various systems, hardware and software systems. It allows the usage for a customer across city lines. All of this says if we build a system to manage the curb well, we can be much more responsive to our commercial and residential users on that curb in a way that produces environmental benefits, operational excellence, and customer-centric designs. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And to make a little bit of a transition here, I'm going to welcome Mitch to, I think Dr. Shoup also covered a little bit of the history of the curb and some of that piece. He's going to bring us into the present now and introduce some of the OMF's work, including the curb data specification.
I apologize in advance. I have a lot of slides, so I'm going to talk kind of fast, but I want to preserve some time for the Q&A afterwards. I'm going to start by briefly covering the last 100 years or so of curb management. By, say, the 1910s, the adoption of the automobile had really taken off, and that put a lot of pressure on cities to provide space for cars. And prior to that, streets and the curb lane specifically had been a real multi-use space that accommodated a lot of different uses like pedestrians and street vendors, lots of horses, various forms of public transit. But there was no effective parking regulation. And so what happened is workers would drive their cars to the downtown jobs and they'd park them all day and leave no room for the cars of customers that patronize the downtown businesses. So in a period of about 10 years, the streets went from being these really vibrant multi-use spaces that served lots of different uses to long-term storage for cars. And that caused a lot of frustration. In 1920, Los Angeles decided they just had to do something. So they decided to ban all daytime parking in the downtown. And people went berserk over this. And there were big protests and lawsuits and so forth. And it ended 17 days later. It didn't work at all because it was actually worse both for the people, for the drivers and for the merchants. Drivers couldn't get to the downtown businesses. Merchants, they didn't have access to the stores, so merchants saw a drop in business. It wasn't just a problem in Los Angeles, it was happening across the country and everywhere. During the 1920s, cities hired beat cops to walk the streets and chalk the tires of the cars and then come back an hour or two later and issue citations. And that was really the way that parking enforcement was handled for quite a long time. There was a failed attempt at a parking meter in the late 1920s, which required the parker of the car to hook their car up to the meter with jumper cables and use the car's battery to power the meter. So that didn't take off. But then in the early 1930s, a newspaper publisher in Oklahoma City was tasked by the local Chamber of Commerce with solving the parking problem, and he developed the first mechanical parking meter, which debuted in 1935. So we had broadcast television before we had a working parking meter. And this is really off topic, but we had a working parking meter before we had shopping carts, which were also invented in Oklahoma City, but not until 1937. Metered parking didn't go over very well at first. There were more lawsuits and lots of meters were destroyed by lovers of free parking, but the idea took off very quickly, and within 10 years, there were over 150,000 meters in the US. Next slide.
Sorry, that was a great
So,
graphic earlier that we missed. It'll be in the slide deck. We'll share it.
So not a lot changed until we get up to the 90s. From the 40s to the 90s, meters looked a lot like the one shown here on the right, many of which were made by the company that built the original meters in Oklahoma City. In 2000, Bill Clinton signed a bill that authorized civilian access to GPS. And that was a real watershed moment that enabled a bunch of new technologies in the years following that. The first pay by phone that used SMS text messages was in Zagreb in 2001. In 2004, OpenStreetMap launched, followed a year later by Google Maps, and there were several others, like, does anyone remember MapQuest? And we started to see Navtech like TomTom that was based off GPS. In 2006, a service called FreeMap Israel launched, which is now owned by Google, and we all know it as Waze. And then in 2007, 2008 came the final nail in the analog curb coffin when the iPhone and Android were released. Next slide. So I'm going to arbitrarily call 2010 the start of digital curb, because it was around that time that a string of events starts that changed how people get around in cities. Uber and Lyft arrive, bike sharing comes to North America. It existed prior to that in Europe. Food trucks become popular. And around 2014, there was this big explosion in delivery services like Uber Eats and Instacart. In 2007, scooters come to cities. That's also the year that the OMF and MDS gets its start in response to scooters. Then comes the pandemic in 2020 and all the changes that brought, like an explosion in package delivery and outdoor dining, which was often situated in the curb lane. And then finally, we've got AVs, autonomous vehicles like Waymo and Cruise. So during roughly a 10-year period, we saw the curb lane transformed from being mostly about parking back into a multi-use space like it was in the early 1900s. And while lots of people enjoy all these new services, it's placed a lot of increased pressure on the curb that led to more need for curb management. And then there's one more thing that I want to sneak in, and that's vehicle size. So CAFE fuel economy standards take the size of the vehicle's footprint into account when they set fuel economy, and then incentivizes manufacturers to build larger vehicles. Hard numbers are really difficult to find, but by some accounts, the average length of vehicles in the US has increased by almost 2 feet in the past decade. So even for a medium-sized city, that comes out to hundreds, if not thousands, of parking spaces that have been gobbled up by the larger and longer vehicles that we're all driving now. So we have a growing list of new uses for the curb, but by redefining the analog parking lane as a digital curb lane, we can better support all these changes. And when parking lanes become curb lanes, that space goes from vehicle storage to supporting a variety of use cases that can benefit both the residents and the businesses. To redefine the curbs, we need a way to collect, analyze, and exchange information about them, and that's where CDS comes in. CDS is an open source data specification. Open source meaning that it's made freely available to use. It's also what's called an open standard. Open source and open standards are two separate things, and that's an important distinction to make, but I'll come back to it later. Open standards are really the backbone of the modern internet. So prior to the adoption of open standards, the internet worked a lot more like cable television, where you would subscribe to an online service, like, for example, CompuServe was one of them. And then CompuServe would determine what content you were able to access, and then they would revoke your access to it if you didn't pay the monthly fee anymore. So you go back one. So what do we mean when we say data specification? The data specification works like a dictionary, where each piece of data in the specification has been clearly defined so that all parties can agree on exactly what the data represents. And standardizing your data with an open standard like CDS has a number of advantages. And one of them is what we call interoperability. And interoperability is the idea that your data can be consumed and acted upon by a range of end users and software without the need for any custom applications. So email is a good example of interoperability. And the reason you can send email from, say, Windows to Macintosh to iPhone to what have you is because it uses a data specification as a common language between all of those platforms. Similar to data interoperability is data portability. Data portability means that if your technology vendor were to go out of business or be acquired, or maybe you just don't want to work with them anymore for whatever reason, then your data can be moved to another vendor or another software application that supports CDS, and then you can buy that. And in doing so, you would protect your investment in your digitization project. So all this leads to reduced costs and effort because much of the work has already been done for you by the cities that came before you. And then finally, standardized data gives you access to this rapidly growing marketplace of data, of curb data management tools that are being developed which support CDS, and they're being developed by vendors for cities.
Is the right slide?
I think you went the
CDS
wrong. No, you're good. You're good.
CDS
That's fine.
overview. Okay.
So CDS is built like a kit of parts, and that provides cities with options so that you only need to implement the parts that the specification that serve your specific needs. The kit's made up of a set of APIs that allow you to publish your policies and then collect event data related to the usage of your curbs, and then there's a set of predefined metrics that allow you to measure how your policies are working. This illustration shows an example of how CDS data might flow across those three APIs. So the city is depicted in black at the top, and they send curb regulation data via the Curbs API, which is the green arrow, down to curb users on the street. Then event data or usage data is depicted by the white arrow, which is captured by things like pole-mounted cameras, or it could be pavement sensors. It could also come from applications that curb users are running on their phones or tablets in their vehicles. And once that data is captured, then it could be processed right there in the field on the lamppost, or it could be done offsite by a third-party vendor. It could also flow directly back to the city. Then in the yellow arrow, we see aggregate metrics data through the metrics API going back to the city. So now we get to the policy part, because this is a policy webinar. One of the primary ways that digital curb management becomes public policy is by requiring standardized data in your RFPs, your contracts, your permits, et cetera. And we've got a guidance document on how to do this on the CDS GitHub, which is linked here in the slides, and then we'll put that link into the chat. Next slide. So there's a few things that you should be thinking about when you're writing digital curb data policy. First, you should be specific and require that any relevant curb data conform to the CDS specification. Next, you need to think about how you're going to handle updates. CDS is under continual development, so we can meet the needs of cities as they change over time. So you're going to want to think about how you're going to handle new versions of the specification as they're released. I've seen policies which specify, for example, version 1, and then changing to version 2 requires them to go back to their city council for another approval, and so the city gets stuck on version 1. We've got some sample language that covers that in the guidance document that I talked about in the previous slide. And finally, if you're contracting with vendors to collect your curb data, then you should ensure that you have ownership over that data in case you want to move it in the future, so you can take advantage of that portability that I talked about earlier. I have to talk for a little bit about what not to do. Here's an example of how not to write a standardized data requirement. And we often see examples like this where they ask for CDS or something else so long as it's open source. I've got bad news for anybody who's doing this. Open source and open standards are two separate things, and they're not interchangeable, and you want both of them. You need to be specific about the standard that you're requiring, and in this case, CDS. Making something open source doesn't make it an open standard. If you leave the door open like this, then you risk the benefits of standardized data, like the interoperability and the data portability that I already talked about. And there's no real single definition of what makes something an open standard. Some are more open than others, but generally it means that the governance is transparent and that the users of the standard have a voice in the standard's development. To wrap up, here's a few takeaways. So the first is that you need to designate your parking lanes as curb lanes, and that's really the first step in rethinking how the space functions. As long as your lanes are designated as parking lanes, then any other use is going to be seen as taking parking away. The second is to begin a digital curb inventory. And that doesn't mean mapping and measuring every curb in your city, but it could. Most cities already have some existing curb data in various formats. So a good first step is to identify all of those assets that you already have and then map them to CDS so that you can determine what data you've already got that could be translated into CDS. Next is prioritizing curb access beyond parking. And by that, I mean, you need to think about how to provide space for some of those new use cases that I listed earlier so that you can begin to transition your curbs back into multi-use spaces. And then as Donald Shoup said earlier, you need to think about how to price your curbs appropriately. If it's cheaper to park on the street than it is in a lot or in a garage, then you won't get the turnover that you need to encourage drivers, and you'll be encouraging drivers to circle the block and so forth. But your pricing can encompass more than just parking. For example, you could also price your loading zones or for other uses of the space. And then underlying all of this is the incorporation of CDS as a requirement in your curb policies, your RFPs, your permits and contracts and so forth. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Millicent, I think.
First, thank you so much, Mitch. I hope everyone is engaged, and I know I learned a few new facts there. As a reminder, we'll have the slides available if you want to look back at some of these action items. First, I'm going to invite Mayor Goldsmith to share a little bit about the practical applications and the data behind this, and then excited to learn about Portland's pilot project that's addressing some real world problems. So to start, let's talk about shared data.
So Millicent and Portland are leaders, so I don't want to take much time to go. Let me just kind of comment on these just really quickly. So the goal, right, both for a city and for the ultimate management is to bring together all available data, paying attention to security and privacy in order to make a range of decisions. Right. So as we do that, what Mitch said is kind of captured on this slide. But how many folks listening to this webinar today have agencies contributing data or using data that are connected to the curb, but not under kind of one data umbrella? So sharing that data through the agency and eventually through other cities as well makes a difference. I don't know if I have another slide, Em, but I've got just two more points to make. So let's look at it from this perspective. One is just think about the goal, right? That is to say, and Don talked about parking, but obviously Mitch's comment is broader than that, which is we have a curb, we have competing uses for the curb, right? We might have valet parking, we might have restaurants, we might have incentives for EV parking from 9 to 11, but customer parking from 5 to 7. It might be one thing, one time a day or a day of the weekend. And so we're trying to use pricing to to affect behaviors. So, and that data then becomes part of how the city manages that curb and sidewalk. So data should then be, if it comes in on the platform, it can then be managed under these different personas, right? The parking manager has this, the city council has that information, the equity officer is trying to see how effective pricing and curb utilization compares neighborhood to neighborhood, and the planning manager or sustainability director uses it for other things. And then I know many of the cities listening are smart city winners, and technically enforcement is not part of the SMART grant, but all that data has to come together in a pretty sophisticated and flexible, what's called compliance engine, right? So how is compliance managed across all of those different modalities to cause the behaviors that we want to occur to actually occur? So just kind of in conclusion, Mitch paid nicely attention to the dramatic changes in technology, and that's augmented by cameras and LPR readers and the like. My point is, operate as a system, think about the data by persona, but make sure those personas are sharing their data, do it on the front end, think about how to nudge behaviors to maximize usage, how to nudge behaviors to maximize revenues where that's appropriate, how to utilize those revenues where it creates equity, And then finally, how to connect all that to a pretty flexible compliance or enforcement management system, because in the end, if there's no compliance or enforcement, then all of this is for naught. But we have an opportunity to dramatically improve curb usage through these systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Mayor Goldsmith referenced that a lot of the cities that the OMF works with, and I work with in particular, is the Smart Curb Collaborative that Portland is a part of. And all of these cities are leading the way in implementing a lot of what we've talked about thus far in this webinar. So excited to hear from Portland and Director Williams about your project. And this is our getting right into it. Sorry, I didn't include the intro slides.
After 4.5 years, I still can't find the mute button. Anyway, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me and the City of Portland, the Portland Bureau of Transportation, to be a part of this really important conversation at a really critical time, I think, for most cities, major cities especially, who are looking at the needs that are in front of us, the needs that continue to develop, the needs that we need to be thoughtful around as we try to imagine the futures of our cities. One of the things that I share with the team often is that we are in a moment. There are things that happened a few years ago that created an opportunity for us to, and need for us to begin to think differently about the way that we move about the right of way, use the right of way, price the right of way. And so the thing that's fortuitous for us is that we weren't the only people thinking about that, and have to that end been able to identify an opportunity to test out some of the things that we've been talking about even today in this conversation, and provide for sister cities or others around the country ideas about what we can do to really be thoughtful about modernizing our curb management practices. We've seen rapid advances in technology and identified the opportunity to use the data to do our work more efficiently and to manage the curb more effectively. We're using data in ways that we had not before. We are working literally smarter. And I don't want to say not harder, we're working hard, but in that hard work, we're working smarter doing that. Given the financial realities, and we are not ashamed to say that we have them. We need to use our data well and use it to inform our actions and be able to explain what that data means for those who are trying to understand how they can partner with us, whether they're a resident, a business, a government entity, whatever. So we're exploring whether and how digitizing our curb rules and using sensors might be able to help. And that's what we'll be talking about a little bit today. And we are hopefully going to be able to prepare ourselves to get ahead of some of the innovation and change that's in front of us. So as has been mentioned, some cities already have AVs, automated vehicles operating on their streets. Portland does not. In a moment of candor, I am concerned about that. I think that there is a future there, but it is something that we do need to be thoughtful around, especially as it relates to who decides where they go and what they do. And so the city does need to be really strong in its defense of how we manage and maintain the right of way and work in partnership with those entities that might want to bring AV technology to the city. So we can dig right into the slides now. So our project has 3 objectives. We want to test a regulated zero-emission delivery zone. That is a unique construct for us, but we're excited about it. We're going to do a trial using parking sensors and other digital infrastructure like the curb data specification, as has been mentioned, to see how they can help us better manage the right-of-way and to expand the use of micro-delivery hubs and e-cargo trikes. So for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the sensors and the digital infrastructure. You can move to the next slide. One key task we started with is hiring a vendor. While we have really incredibly smart and talented, gifted people within the organization. We recognized in order for us to do this well, we would need to hire a vendor to provide a complete digital inventory of all the curb rules in the city. So this is important because it gives us a baseline or a base map to understand curb management throughout Portland. In our pilot project, we're also contracting with 2 parking sensor companies whose sensors will be installed at truck loading zones in order to help us understand usage. Unlike traditional methods of measuring curb use that involve sending lots of people out into the field to count cars for 1 or 2 days a year, these sensors will be able to provide us with a more robust understanding of how loading zones are used on a daily basis. And so we plan to combine the parking sensor data with our baseline curb inventory using open source data standards to gain new insights about how the transportation system is used. This is all new for us, and we're excited to see how to use these technologies and how they might be able to help us to better manage the right-of-way. So is there another slide? Yeah, so we are working, as I mentioned, with the contractors. You saw the image in the last slide about how we anticipate that the data will be picked up. We recognize that suggesting that we have this zero emissions vehicles zone for loading and unloading will present a challenge for some folks. But it also requires us to really stick to, I don't want to say stick to our guns, to be really thoughtful and provide a stringent framework in which those folks who will be doing deliveries in this zone that we've created, make it so that they will be able to comply, but also if in fact they are outside of compliance, that there is the obvious benefit to them making the investments that are necessary so that we can move to a zero emissions zone. So the contracting that we have had to engage in does require a great deal of patience. While we have the benefit of having a grant that helps to support us doing this discovery, we have to work really closely with our partners internal to the city to make sure that we can move things forward. But given that sometimes municipal contracting can be, or statewide contracting can be challenging, we are leveraging a cooperative. We are purchasing through a cooperative called Sourcewell. It's kind of like the Amazon for the public sector. And that is helping us to identify the entities, the companies, the tools that we'll be able to use. Finally, one of the things that's really important for us as an organization is if we are to do this work and do it well, we have to be intentional and thoughtful about focusing on doing the work, not having it as a hobby or someone's side responsibility, but really truly focused. And so I'm pleased that over the course of the past several months, we've been looking at how we can function better as an organization, taking advantage of embracing the energy of the moment and engaging staff who do bring that innovative spark to the organization, elevating that to a formal space. And so we've created a mobility and partnerships office that is going to help us to really not just take advantage of grant opportunities, but really be thoughtful and thought leaders on how we can reimagine the use of the right-of-way and how we price the right-of-way and how we are able to influence not just the ways that folks deliver, but the ways that they think about how to sustain their businesses, especially as it relates to moving goods and services through the zones that we will hopefully be able to throughout the city identify as being zero emissions zones. Is that it for me?
I think that's the end of the
Okay.
slides, and we're right on time. So if you wanted another 30 seconds or a minute to share any other lessons, I would just highlight the structuring the organization for success is really important here. We've heard that from a lot of other cities.
It is really important. And again, the team has always been innovative, but having a focused eye on making sure that we not just staff it, but fund that work is important. And those folks who are in that office, I believe many of you work with Jacob Sherman on a regular basis. they are also responsible and leading the way in helping to identify the funding that allows us to engage in these pilot projects. And so the zero emissions zone that we're working to implement now, people who never thought about being able to do this, our printing and whatever else they do, shop is within the zone, and they deliver printed materials all over town. And they never thought that they would consider using a zero emissions vehicle. We've been able to, through a partnership, also get them to begin to change their minds. So they have a vehicle now, a zero emissions vehicle. They are in that zone. And so as we continue to work with our partners internal to the city and certainly externally, we are looking forward to being able to herald the success of this effort. It is a team project and a team sport, but it's refreshing to see that people are open to being innovative, even in spaces that traditionally have not been a playground for that innovation.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that and sharing more about some of the applications of all of these topics we're talking about. And I'm sure that in a year's time, you're going to have more to add to these lessons learned slide, but we'll check back, of course. I'm going to open up to Q&A. And for those who are, all right, now I can actually see the Q&A box. Looking at your suggestions here, Mayor Goldsmith had to leave a little bit early, so we still have some great panelists here to offer some expertise. So I like this anonymous attendee question to start us off. How has your view of cities and curb management changed since the recent shift to more telecommuting remote work? I'm curious if maybe Director Williams, you have anything to start with?
I kind of alluded to it in my introductory comments. When the pandemic hit communities across the country, Portland was no less hard hit than any other place. And frankly, the Transportation Bureau in the city of Portland, and it's not a unique phenomenon, but much of our general transportation revenues come from parking revenue. In fact, half of it. So when you lose half of your basic funding based on the fact that people just aren't driving and parking, you have to begin to think differently. As we have continued to better understand how people are moving about in communities, the challenge is real with regard to understanding what we should be doing with parking spaces, being creative around what we do with them. But it's a challenge. It's something that we think about all the time. Do we continue to do parking enforcement? Absolutely. Will we continue to look at creative ways to use the right-of-way and thereby price the right-of-way because of the alternative uses like parklets, like outdoor dining, all of those things that I think people have now become really excited about. And many cities did that initially in support of keeping their communities vital and thriving. That is not a free service, just in case anyone is curious. It does cost something. And so, maybe I'm the ogre who's like, yeah, that's what it costs to do business, but it does cost something to do business. And so we just continue to work through how to navigate around that. But it is a real challenge.
Thanks for sharing that. Okay, we've got more questions coming in. We'll probably have to spend 5 more minutes on these and then do some wrap up. But let's look at this is definitely a bigger question in the realm of working with the public. And Mitch's presentation alluded to some revolts at the beginning of curb enforcement. I looked at the newspaper in my own town, and there was the same thing happened there. How do you propose, this is from Mark Frumar, how do you propose a successful introduction of dynamic pricing at the curb, given the expected pushback from the public? And yeah, I wonder if the finance or money revenue question helps with that. I don't know.
I guess that's for me again.
I think that one, yeah.
Okay. Well, can you repeat the part of the question I heard? Oh, the public involvement piece.
Yeah.
So you'll often hear me say this if people hear me talking, public involvement is at the heart of most everything that we do. So there are very few actions or activities that we engage in that don't have a nexus around how we connect with community. What we have heard, especially as we have seen more people coming back into the meter districts, when we ask them about how they feel about pricing increases for parking, it was an interesting comment. They're less concerned about the price of parking and more concerned about the safety of the environment in which they're parking. So that is something that we do focus on, but many people don't know how much they pay. I think if we had a big jump from the fairly small fee that we charge for an hour's worth of parking at the curb, there would be a pretty huge outcry. Of course, in the meter districts, you also are largely in business districts. And so we don't want to be a barrier to businesses being successful because they are concerned about the cost of parking and that people will not want to patronize their businesses because of the cost of parking. But we intend to ensure that as funding comes in for to pay for parking, whether it's at the current level or at increased levels, that funding goes to support basic maintenance. It goes to support the things that people say they want as well. So what we found is that people don't mind paying for what they want. As long as we do it well, we report out on it, we have integrity in our process. And so we are able to pave, stripe, maintain roads. We are able to replace signals with that funding. It also goes towards supporting our climate work and our equity work, all of our work, regardless as to whether we're doing basic maintenance or capital projects, the more extensive, larger, more costly and intricate projects. We view it all through an equity lens. We have to do that based on the unfortunate, in some instances, disinvestment or underinvestment in certain parts of our community. We need to serve everyone well. So parking management ties in with maintaining order in the right of way, as we know. In a couple of weeks ago, early May, we had a gas tax measure that we were asking voters to consider or renew a gas tax, 10 cents per gallon, local gas tax. And it passed overwhelmingly. They had 72% support from community, which told us what we thought, which is they want us to do the basic maintenance. And again, that parking, and as much as if we are doing our job well as a transportation agency and addressing climate and getting people to look at alternatives and not necessarily driving, we will continue to see diminishing returns. So that said, for those who are driving, they do want to be able to use the roads and use them with ease. And so there's this internal conflict that we have. But to the extent that there are folks who are motorists, they're willing to, according to what they said when they voted, pay for the maintenance that we need through the gas tax. All of that comes together. How do we get people to move into electric vehicles? How, all of those things, it's a super intricate cycle, none that I think it would surprise anyone. But again, if we are doing our jobs well and causing people to choose other modes of travel, to live in communities that are more walkable, to do all those things, then, you know, from a funding standpoint, we will find ourselves needing to look at different alternatives. And I don't know that parking will be the answer. Pricing the curb will be.
Yeah, very well said. I'm gonna ask one more question, and Director Williams, you'll be off the hook for this one.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much for adding all of your comments there. So this is a little bit more about the curb data specification. So either Mitch or Andrew, if you feel inclined to talk to this, based on the multiple opportunities that curb management has to offer, where do current priorities lie in advancing the definition of an open standard for curb management?
So I think maybe the best way to answer that is to send people to the CDS GitHub and have them take a look at the open issues. You know, as I said earlier, CDS is under continual development. We're at version 1 right now. There will be a version 1.1 and a version 2 and so forth in the coming months or years. And those priorities really have to do with identifying real existing use cases in the world. So we don't want to add features to the specification speculatively. We want to address problems that exist in the world. And some of the things that we're looking at right now are changes to geometries used in the specification. So right now we use polygons to describe everything from an individual parking space to a zone or a larger area in a city. The other thing we're talking about is what we call curb objects. So these are things that are along or adjacent to the curb, like fire hydrants and I want to say phone booths, but we don't have those anymore. Bus stops and planters and benches and parklets and all those types of things that you find in the right of way now. And then electric vehicle charging is also another topic that we're interested in. I saw there was another question in the queue here about EVs and charging. There are a number of EV standards in the world, and rather than recreate work that's already been done, we're looking at how that data can be incorporated into CDS, and maybe not in the level of detail. So we would identify EV charging as a service that's available in the right of way. We might not have additional functionality, like, for example, payment, that would be handled in a broader specification.
Right. So we have some great questions in the chat that we won't have time for, unfortunately, to answer live. I will say that if you keep up with the OMF's work, you will get some answers to some of these questions. I know specifically this one that Leslie Anderson asked about any tips on keeping your curbside inventory up to date once it's completed. This is a question, a problem that a lot of the SMART grant, SMART Curb collaborative cities are engaging with right now, and we expect we're going to have some lessons learned, much as Director Williams shared earlier on some of the earlier lessons from these projects. But this is definitely one that I think cities talking together, learning from one another, are going to advance the field as a whole. So to wrap us up, first, thank you so much to our panelists, to our guest, Dr. Shoup, for giving us a little introduction here. This is a really exciting beginning of a very quickly, rapidly advancing field, and we're very grateful to be with you all, learning together about this. The OMF is really trying to host conversations like this, enable cities to share with one another, enable vendors and anyone else in this ecosystem to learn from one another. So thank you so much for getting involved. I would do another screen share, but I think we're just gonna share it verbally for now. Our links will share for any attendee who is registered, so whether you're able to make it or not. All of the follow-up materials, that includes slide decks, all of the links mentioned to our GitHub, any other reading materials related to procurement and things related to the Smart Curb Collaborative will be linked in that deck. And thanks so much for spending an hour with us on curb management. Don't forget about some of the lessons in here. Check out the best practices tips that Mitch shared for policymakers, and please reach out. OMF membership is free for cities to join. We have a great community of people who support our work, and we're made better by more people and more agencies and companies all joining us. So thank you for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you soon.